Hi there. Good evening, everyone. Very nice to see everyone here this evening. Really, this is such a wonderful occasion. I want to just start by acknowledging that this lecture is our annual Nili Adler Memorial Lecture, which gives us a time to remember our dear colleague, Nili Adler, who loved Hebrew, who was a beloved teacher, and promoted Israeli Hebrew language here in Cleveland. May her memory be for a blessing. This event this evening is sponsored by a number of organizations that came together, and I want to acknowledge all of them. Firstly, the Israel Arts Connection of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, who has supported the lecture, the Jewish Arts and Culture Lab of the Mandel JCC, and this lecture, as all of our annual Israeli author lectures, is sponsored by the Herbert and Mariana Luxemburg Lecture Fund. And we're grateful, as always, for this fund allowing us to have this as an annual event and really part of the Cleveland Jewish landscape. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to draw your attention to a few of our programs that are upcoming, some of the particularly exciting things coming up. One is to mark Yom Yerushalayim, 50 years since the Six-Day War. We'll have here Professor Benny Morris from Ben Gurion University. He'll be speaking actually on Yom Yerushalayim itself, on looking back at the Six-Day War. We'll have him here both for an evening lecture, a large public lecture, which we're having hosted at the Agnon Mandel School, just sort of up the road there. And then in the morning, he'll be speaking to a more intimate crowd here. Registration for the morning event is required. So I encourage you to come, and please be sure to register in advance. Oh, it's on, I'm sorry, I said Yom Yerushalayim. I thought everyone knows when that is. But it's on, the evening lecture is on May 24th. It's a Wednesday night, May 24th, and then he's speaking the next day in really a moderated discussion with Brian Amkraut at 10 a.m. on Thursday, May 25th. I also want to draw your attention to June marks 1 year since Elie Wiesel's passing. And we've organized a lecture series that's held almost every week in June, Monday nights in June, where we have 3 of Elie Wiesel's students who are now important figures in their own right, who will be coming to Cleveland to speak about his memory and his legacy from a variety of different perspectives. So please keep your eyes open for that. Sorry, I meant to tell you one other thing about Benny Morris's events while he's here. The morning event, if you can come or if you can't, I want to let you know that it's going to be somewhat interactive, and by that what I mean is we're going to be having a moderated discussion that's called something like Reflections on 1967 Then and Now. And I'm soliciting contributions from people who will offer their memory of 1967, what it meant to you at the time, what you remember from the events of 1967 at the time, either in Israel or in the United States. And thinking back today, 50 years later on 1967, how your thoughts have changed over the past 50 years. So we're hoping to really engage in a sort of active audience-generated participation conversation, and I'm a little bit nervous about leaving it up to chance on the spot, so that's why I'm asking for written submissions. Please drop me an email if you're not sure what I'm talking about but think you want to participate. Drop me an email also to have your reflections be included in the conversation that day. And finally, I'll just end with, we have Tribe Talk, New Jewish Conversations, which is a monthly series that I run with our executive director, Brian Amkraut. It's an informative conversation on trending Jewish news. It's very fun, very engaging. It's on Monday nights at the end of the month. Our next one coming up is Monday, May 22nd. Okay, now I'm going to turn our attention to the events at hand. So I'm going to introduce Ayelet Tsabari in a moment, but just want to alert you to the fact that this is one of a series of events that she'll be doing. We have her speaking tomorrow morning also, delivering a lecture called New Mizrahi Voices, Changes in Israeli Literature, and it's really contemporary. It's about what's going on in Israel and the Israeli literary scene right now, so it should prove very interesting. For those of you who are Hebrew speakers, we'll have tomorrow at 4 p.m. Ayelet will be holding an informal conversation in Hebrew about her work. If you have not registered, please, before you leave, make sure you either tell Cheryl or myself that you'll be here. And on Thursday, we have a writer's workshop. Unfortunately, it's filled up, which I'm happy to say from our end. But hopefully we'll be able to have Ayelet back sometime soon and other workshops, so stay tuned for other kinds of programs like that. Now, to our guest, Ayelet Tsabari, who came in this afternoon from Toronto. She was born in Israel to a large family of Yemeni descent and lived in Israel until she immigrated in 1998 to Vancouver, Canada. And there in Canada, she graduated from the Simon Fraser University's Writer Studio and also received an MFA in the program in creative writing at the University of Guelph. Her debut story collection, which she'll be speaking about this evening, called The Best Place on Earth, won the 2015 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, as well as the Edward Lewis Walland Prize. The book was also a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and was nominated for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. The book has been translated into several languages and has been published internationally to great acclaim. I'm so happy to have Ayelet with us to share her work. Thank you. Please give her a warm welcome.
All right, is it working? Can you hear me? It's working. Okay, great. All right, I'm going to move just a little bit out of the way. So, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk today a little bit about how the book came to be. Talk about some of the challenges I faced as a writer. Sorry. There's too many things on this table. All right. I'll then show you some photos from my research. And I'll also share one traditional recipe from my mom. So have your pens ready. And we'll have time for questions at the end. But first I'm going to start by reading a very short excerpt from a story from the book. The story is The Poets in the Kitchen Window. And it's a few pages in. I will find it. And what do you need to know? It takes place during the First Gulf War in Israel. The protagonist is Uri. He's a 13-year-old boy, a budding poet. And one more thing, because I've been told that that term is, not everyone in the US is familiar with it. Mizrahi is a fairly, I guess, new term in Israel. It's most commonly used nowadays to describe Jews who came from Arab lands, Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent. Sort of replaces Sephardic, which now refers to pre-Inquisition Spanish Jews specifically. So that's the one most commonly used nowadays in Israel, and I'll be referring to that term a lot. So yeah, get that out of the way. That night, when the siren cried, Uri and Yasmin hurried to their parents' bedroom. By then, Uri and his father had developed a routine. There was no talking as they put on their gas masks. Uri turned on the TV. His dad wetted the same towel, the one his mother had taken from a hotel in Eilat during a family vacation, and stuffed it in the gap under the door. Uri wondered how a single wet towel was going to protect them from nerve gas. In his head, he started to compose his next poem. This is my generation's war. a war fought with plastic sheets and duct tape, a wet towel stolen from a hotel room in Eilat, a picture of a sandy beach on a sunny day. After the poetry contest, the bullying that followed, he had conceded that poetry was nothing short of social suicide and resolved to quit writing at once. Being the shortest, youngest boy in class was challenging enough. And what was the point anyway? There was no future or fame in poetry. Last year, he had found a notebook in his father's nightstand filled with scribbled verse dated decades ago. He struggled to decipher the handwriting. He couldn't even tell how good the poetry was. When he asked his mother, she told him that his father had given up writing when they met because he thought it was impractical for someone like him and went on to become an accountant instead. Uri understood. The poetry they taught at school, the books he found in the school library, were mostly written by old Ashkenazi men. He had never heard of a Yemeni poet, or any Mizrahi poet for that matter. His father had come from a poor Yemeni family, had grown up with no electricity in a tiny two-room bungalow in the Yemeni Grove in Tel Aviv, had worked since he was a kid to help his parents, who arrived in Israel with nothing and hardly spoke Hebrew. Uri never told his father he wrote poetry, but he ended up finding the school paper in Uri's room. "It's just this stupid thing I had to do for school," Uri said. And his father eyed him strangely but said nothing. Later, Uri saw that his father kept the paper on his bedside table, tucked between books. I'll stop here. So I have a soft spot for Uri. I love them all. They're all my children. But Uri and I do have a lot in common. I was born and raised in Israel to a large family of Yemeni descent. My grandparents arrived in Israel in the 1930s. And like Uri, I started to write at a very, very early age. I was also an avid reader growing up, but in all the books that I loved, I never found a character like me. And I never knew of a Yemeni author. The books that I loved and cherished as a kid were all written by Ashkenazi authors and told Ashkenazi stories. In school, most of the books they assigned to us were similarly written by Ashkenazi authors. My literary heroines were all fair-skinned and blonde. And even in history classes, very little was mentioned in terms of Mizrahi history. So that by the time I graduated from high school, I could cite the dates of the European immigration to Israel in great detail, but I knew next to nothing about my own history. So not seeing myself in the books they assign us to in school, in history class, in the books I found in the library, told me that my story and my family history and our memory and our narrative didn't matter. I have one faded picture from childhood in which I'm dressed in authentic Yemeni clothing. I have this large tunic with yellow and red stitching and a hood and a row of silver coins over my bangs. This was the extent of my interest in my culture growing up. It was a Purim costume that was passed on around my cousins, just like the Dutch girl outfit I wore the year before and the Japanese kimono that I wore the year after. So growing up, my father was my #1 fan. And like Uri's father in the Poets in the Kitchen Window, he grew up in a Yemeni neighborhood, lived in a tiny bungalow with no electricity. He studied for his exams on the sidewalk under the street lamp and worked in menial jobs all day. And he was also a closeted poet who gave up his literary dreams to become a lawyer. My father passed away when I was 10. And after his death, I went to his office one day in downtown Petah Tikva. I just wanted to spend some time with his things and just sort of absorb his presence somehow. And I started opening drawers, and I found this notebook with his poetry. And the pages were all crinkly and old and yellow. And I took it home, and I put it under my pillow for a while, and then eventually I gave it to my mother. But in one of the poems, he hears whispers that tell him to burn it all. It's a voice that says, I am probably poorly translating, "A poet's craft is an artist's kingdom, not for you, son of Yemen." And that line just broke my heart. I knew there were no Yemeni poets published in his time. He had no role models in his community to look up to. So I moved to Canada at 25. And in Canada, I discovered that for Canadians, Jews meant delis and lox and matzo ball soups. Most people I met in Vancouver had never encountered a Yemeni Jew, knew nothing of Mizrahi traditions. I remember the local paper actually acknowledged Passover in an article. That was a big deal. It was such a small community that, big holidays would go unnoticed. And I was thrilled to read the article. And the entire article was focusing on different preparations of matzo ball soups. And at that time in my life, I've never even had matzo ball soup. And in my family, we eat Yemeni soup for Passover, or a spicy fish. People often ask me if I spoke Yiddish. They stared at me confused and actually said, "But you look like an Arab." So I explained, my grandmother lived amongst Arabs in a small village by the Saudi border. She spoke Arabic and a Yemeni dialect and little Hebrew till the end of her days. And she wouldn't know matzo ball if it hit her in the face. Then when I started reading in English, I discovered that the portrayal of Jewish experience in English language books was even narrower than it was in Israel. There was never any Iraqi Jews or Tunisian or Ethiopian Jews. No wonder people in Canada were so confused by me. And then 10 years ago, I started to write in English. Trying to describe that switch from Hebrew to English is difficult because it wasn't really a definite moment, nor was it a clear decision. It sort of happened, and it happened gradually. When I first moved to Canada, I couldn't comprehend writing in English, in my second language. I didn't think my grammar and vocabulary were up to par. They weren't up to par. I found reading in English extremely frustrating. And at the same time, I struggled to write in Hebrew because I was no longer using it on a day-to-day basis. And it was before, social media, so I didn't have that direct link to Israel like I do now. So I went through a few difficult years of not writing at all. At the time, I excused it as a writer's block. But I tell my students all the time that writer's block is basically fear. And I was terrified. I was terrified on taking on writing in a new language. I realized, looking back, that maybe it wasn't just a block, too. It was kind of a limbo. It's like the writer in me had to die a little bit in order to be reborn in a new language. And it was an excruciating and lengthy process. For a while, I wrote intermittently in both languages. They just sort of bled into each other. It was an incoherent mess. Nobody could make sense of it. My English was still not good enough, and it felt like it would never be good enough. But at the same time, I was also starting to feel enamored and excited about the newness of English. Samuel Beckett was asked in 1954 why he chose to write in his second language. He wrote in French. His answer, out of a need to be ill-equipped. And I realized reading that I needed to be ill-equipped because I thrive on challenges. It keeps me on my toes. It makes me humble. English for me, despite it being, the most spoken language in the world, actually I don't even know if that's true. To me, it felt like this secret language. Our lack of attachment, our lack of shared history allowed for this fresh affair to begin. It gave space for invention, for fantasy. And I found comfort in the anonymity that it afforded me. It was also an excellent exercise in constraint because I had to tell a story with fewer words. There is no question that I was a different writer in Hebrew. And I say was because I rarely write in Hebrew anymore, out of fear to jeopardize whatever it is that I've achieved in English. And when I read my Hebrew writing now, every so often I do, I recognize it in it, this richness of language that sometimes I worry that my English writing lacks. On good days, I see it as an advantage. I think my writing is cleaner now. I was young when I was writing in Hebrew. I think I enjoyed flaunting my vocabulary. But on bad days, I sometimes sort of ache for the ease of Hebrew. It's the language that flowed in my mother's milk. There's nothing that can replace that. And I wonder if I'll ever be able to achieve that kind of ease and that kind of flow in English, or if I'll ever be able to reclaim it in Hebrew. And then there was the issue of writing about Israel. Being a new writer who just took on the challenge of writing in a new language, for a long time I wanted nothing to do with that. Israel is such a loaded place that writing about it is bound to be perceived as political, no matter what you do and what you write about. And I just wasn't sure if I was ready for that responsibility. I was too scared to make people angry. I was scared to somehow get it wrong, as if there's only one way to represent the place and the people who live in it. So whenever I wrote about Israeli characters, they were generally outside of Israel, and their nationality was incidental. But this nagging voice that just won't let me go told me, no, this is not what you're supposed to do. You need to write about Israel. And at the last minute, I gave in to that urge and decided to go for it. I was filled with such dread and such anxiety that I knew I must be on the right track. One of the quotes that really spoke to me during that time was by Cynthia Ozick, who said, "If we blow into the narrow end of the shofar, we will be heard far. But if we choose to be mankind rather than Jewish and blow into the wider part, we will not be heard at all." So I resigned myself to the fact that I'll probably, piss some people off. I decided to commit to my own little brand of truth. I call it truth with a small t, rather than, taking on the burden of representing an entire nation or a people. I was not interested in writing war stories. I'm not interested in writing about the conflict. I'm interested in mini conflicts. I'm interested in relationships and people's dynamics. But of course, in Israel, the political and the domestic are so tightly entwined, there is no separating the two. So I wanted to explore that sense of tension and contention that is threaded through everyday life in Israel, and how it affects people's relationships and people's dynamics. Often when I read news about other places in the world, other troubled places in the world, these are the stories I want to know. I immediately imagine, people's daily lives amidst the tragedy and the terror and the war. I picture people falling in love and breaking up and sisters fighting over clothes. And I think that's what fiction does best. While a reporter would be standing on a rooftop and there's the smoky city in the background, and he'll be talking about people as a mass. Fiction zooms in on that one house, that one family, and that one voice. And by doing that, I think it helps create empathy and makes us see the other as less other. So writing the book from another country in a language that is foreign to me and to the place that I'm depicting. It adds layers of displacement that mirror the experience of my characters, who, like me, are often transient and often in between. They're living in those unfixed spaces that are in between places, in between identities, in between languages. So for me, the book was a way to showcase the diversity of Israel. You know, it's a country of immigrants. It's a country of children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants. And my own immigration really made me reflect on my grandparents' experience and their journey from Yemen to Israel, and see them in a whole different way. As a child, hanging out with my grandmother was not my idea of a good time. Her house had no toys and no candy. We didn't really have a common language. I struggled to understand her heavily accented Hebrew. She struggled to understand my fast-paced Hebrew speaking. I wish she spoke Yiddish rather than Arabic, because it was a language that I learned to associate with the enemy. You know, I envied my classmates who had grandmothers who had this puffy hair and wore lipstick and heels and took them to matinees. And then moving to Canada and becoming an immigrant and learning to live in a new language. At least I had some basis, she had none. It really made me see my grandparents in a new light and understand them in ways that I couldn't before. And that was one of the reasons that I became interested in writing about my heritage and writing Mizrahi stories, writing Yemeni stories. I started researching. I became drawn to that identity that I once snubbed, and started asking questions. And luckily, I had a chance to do that before my grandmother passed away. Stylistically, I think one of my biggest challenges was to allow myself to be all of these things that I am. Be Israeli, be Mizrahi, be Jewish, be English, writing, Hebrew, speaking, Canadian, immigrant, writer, and let it all show in my writing style and in my voice. When I first started writing in English, I noticed this recurring theme in the feedback I was receiving from peers, mostly. I was often told that my sentences were too long, that my images were too sentimental, that my dialogue was too direct. I remember one student actually just wrote, it's only the second paragraph and already it's too much. So, obviously didn't know Israelis very well. So I began studying text, literary magazines, and I just tried to emulate their style. I was trying to do what they're doing, changing the way that I wrote in order to fit into whatever I thought were the literary conventions. And I was a good student. I did okay, but I wasn't happy. Something was wrong. Something was missing. I felt this growing sense of self-betrayal. My Israeli, Jewish, Yemeni heritage, my upbringing, my mother tongue, the collective memory of my people had all shaped my personality, which in turn informed my writing, not just in terms of content, but style as well. It was threaded through everything in my stories, including word choice. Great example, the poet Roni Somek said that while French poets would compare a red sunset to wine and English poets would compare it to rose, Israeli poets would compare it to blood. Furthermore, many of the rules that I struggled to implement in my writing made no sense when you situated them against an Israeli context. For example, those of you who have ever taken a fiction class probably heard, that dialogue must always have subtext, that people always say one thing but mean another. I thought that was the weirdest thing. Israeli writing tends to be more sentimental, it's true. Often maybe even verging on melodrama, because we're passionate people, we're dramatic people, We prefer reading Latin American literature over North American one. We prefer watching telenovelas over days of our lives because we see ourselves more reflected in that temperament. And I think my love of narrative, my love of story, of writing exposition and writing summary must be inspired by a history of oral tradition, because as a Yemeni Jew, this is the literary tradition that I come from. And finally, I think transience and belonging are very Jewish themes. Jewish writing does often have a nostalgic tone and a sense of longing, because our collective history, a series of losses, migrations, and wars, haunts our present. Eventually, I was lucky to have a mentor, author Camilla Gibb, who encouraged me to own my voice and write in my own way and toss the guidelines and the set of rules. And with her support and under her guidance, I wrote The Best Place on Earth. Toni Morrison said, "If there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." Things have improved in Israel since my father's time, and improved even more since my childhood, but still very few Mizrahi writers have made it into the school curriculum or into the Israeli canon. And the history they teach students is still very Eurocentric. As an Israeli of Yemeni descent, I wanted to complicate people's view of Israel and people's view of Jewishness. I wanted to expand the frame of the single Jewish story. So it was my mission to tell Mizrahi stories and to create Mizrahi heroines whose skin color ranged from olive to brown, who had curly hair, whose grandparents spoke Arabic and not Yiddish. I created for myself the characters that were missing from my childhood stories and from the English narratives I later found in North America. Characters like my father and like my mother and my grandmother and myself. I wrote the book I wanted to read. I'm going to read another short excerpt from the title story. What is happening here? Okay. I have to do some improvisation here. So, this is from the story, The Best Place on Earth. And it's about halfway through. And it tells of Naomi, who is a woman from Jerusalem, who is visiting her sister Tamar, who lives in this beautiful Gulf island off the coast of British Columbia. Yeah, I think that's all you need to know. After breakfast, she asked to use the computer to check the news. "Please don't," Tamar said. "You're on vacation." She had stopped reading news from Israel years ago. She said, "It's all bad anyway." Naomi turned on the computer, typing it Ynet's URL, a pigua in Jerusalem. 10 injured, nobody dead. For a moment, she could see how her country might look to a Canadian, how Jerusalem could be perceived as the worst place to live, raise a family, a dangerous, troubled city torn between faith, a hotbed for fanatics and fundamentalists. 10 years ago, on their visit to Vancouver, Naomi and Ami had asked Tamar to take them out. They had been younger then, intoxicated by the sense of freedom new parents experience on their first vacation away from their child. "Let's party all night," Ami said. "This isn't Jerusalem. There's no all night here," Tamar said. "Well, that sucks." "Maybe, but it's also safe and civilized." "Safe," Ami scoffed. "Overrated." They all laughed. Later, he said to Naomi, "Maybe people in Vancouver don't party as much because their lives are too comfortable. You know, the whole drink, dance, and be merry because tomorrow you might die kind of thing. Maybe there's something good about knowing it could all end at any minute." She had thought he was being morbid, but now it made sense. She was so used to living in a constant state of urgency, verging on emergency. No wonder the quiet made her uneasy. She looked at the screen. Israeli soldiers and paramedics frozen in mid-action, their faces grim and alert. A carcass of a car, broken pieces of twisted metal, a dark stain on asphalt. She didn't miss this. Yet she couldn't even fathom living anywhere else. "It's too much," Tamar had said to her on her last visit. It's just too intense for me. She was right, Naomi had thought. Sometimes it was too much. She loved and hated Jerusalem, a city that would forever be contested, forever divided, never at peace. But there was more to Jerusalem than what one saw in the news, like how beautiful it was. Not in the way Vancouver was, but in a hard, raw, and broken way. How it felt alive, a kind of beast, pulsating, breathing, vibrating under her feet. How sometimes when she walked through the old city and saw tourists snapping photos and looking at everything with awe, she would see Jerusalem through their eyes and be reminded that people used to walk there 2,000 years ago in togas. And it would make her feel small and insignificant, but in a good way. How at times the city truly felt sacred, magical, the center of everything. Like at sunset, when the sun reflected crimson and gold on the limestone, and the dome of the rock shone like a rare amber in the middle of the city. Or on a winter night when it snowed and everything was briefly muted and still, the sharp edges softened. Or how on Friday evenings when the buses disappeared into the jaws of Central Station to park for Shabbat, and the Hasidic neighborhoods blocked their roads from traffic, and everywhere smelled of home-cooked dinners, it felt like the most peaceful city in the world, the best place on earth. All right. So I think we have to turn off some lights. So what I'm going to show you right now, so I've been engaged in this research into Yemeni Jewish history and culture for a few years now. So for me, the research was never about collecting material for a specific project. It was just something that fueled my work and inspired my work. I knew I wanted to tell Yemeni stories. Later it became just Mizrahi stories in general, but just my heritage, my culture became this focal point of my writing. And so once I started doing that, everybody wanted to tell me stories. I would be walking around Yemeni neighborhoods in Israel, and everybody wanted to invite me to their home and feed me and tell me, share their wisdom and their folkloric stories and their saying and their recipes. And it was mostly women that I chose to interview. So I'm going to show you some of those photos. But first of all, this is, me in a Yemeni outfit, like I promised. I'm about 7 there, and this is my cousin Liat. She's dressed as a cow, apparently. And look at that, that's me as a cow, a year later. All right, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with this image. I just wanted to show it to sort of support some of the things that I was mentioning before. This is an art piece by Meir Gal, 9 out of 400. And the book that he's holding is called History of the Jewish People. Again, I lost my notes, so I'm not entirely sure of the exact wording, but History of the Jewish People in Recent Generations or something like that. That was the textbook that was given to students at high schools back when he went to school. And these are the only 9 pages that are dedicated to Mizrahi history in the entire book. Yeah. It's one of those instances where a picture just speaks volumes. So I mentioned before that my grandmother was the impetus for my research and my writing about Yemeni stories and Mizrahi stories. This is me at 7. She's I'm not really sure how old she was. She never had an actual age because there were no dates or birth certificates issued in Yemen. I think she probably was close to 70, and we are both practicing the Hebrew alphabet. She decided, it was long after my grandfather died, and she decided to go and finally learn how to read and write. In Yemen, girls didn't go to school. That's why I mentioned before, when she came to Israel, she knew no Hebrew at all. My grandfather knew some Hebrew from prayer, but women didn't pray and didn't learn Hebrew at all. So she came completely without a language. That's her during the months that I was interviewing her. Luckily, I got it all on video, too. And that's a rare photo in which she is smiling. She's holding my niece here, and that's my mother next to her. And that's her house. It's after she left, so it's abandoned here, but it was never in great shape. So this was the fourth house in the neighborhood of Sha'ariya. Sha'ariya appears in 2 to 3 stories, I think, in the book. 2 for sure, maybe 3. Growing up, we went there every week, and even though it was only like a 10-minute walk from my house, it felt like a different country. You know, it always stayed a little bit behind. And it was founded by Yemeni immigrants to then Palestine in the 30s. And that was the fourth house building. Not entirely correct. First, my grandfather built a mud hut, and later on, he replaced it with that. The mud hut was just the old architecture that they used to build in Yemen, just straw that mixed the dust, just dried in the straw and mud that was dried in the sun and made into bricks. But later on, they moved into this house. And that's just some pictures from the neighborhood. These are the newer buildings that were built when more immigrants came. This is just when was it built and when was it taken?
When was it taken?
Oh, just in the last few years.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, Petah Tikva, that's right. Sorry, it's a neighborhood in Petah Tikva. That's right. It used to be a village, and then the city sort of annexed it. But when it was founded, it was a village. Now, I love that photo. That's just the men coming back from the synagogue on Saturday morning, just strolling. You know, there were no cars in the neighborhood on Shabbat, just out of respect, usually. So, okay, so this is Yemen, right here, obviously. This is the Red Sea on its west, Oman on the east, and the Gulf of Aden in the bottom. So my family came from a tiny little village called Haidan Asham that is a day's ride on a donkey, according to my grandmother, from Saada, which is a walled city not far from the border with Saudi Arabia. So you can see it's very far from Sana'a, the capital. So it was very isolated. It's kind of a minority within a minority. They called it the Wild North, because it was just, they walked barefoot, and they also had it easier. Yeah, they also had it easier too because they were rural. They lived in better relationship with their neighbors, with the Muslim neighbors, while the ones who lived in the city were more subject to some of the draconian rules, like, their houses had to be shorter, they couldn't ride horses and things like that, but they didn't have to do any of that. So what they did when they came in 1934 is they walked all the way to Aden, which took weeks or maybe months. She was unclear about that. And then they took a boat from Aden to, I'll move here. So they took a boat from Aden to Port Said in Egypt, right here, and then another boat filled with cattle to Haifa. So when I started researching and I finally figured out where we were from, because I literally did not know that growing up, I looked into Haidan Asham, no result, nothing. Everything I looked, my last name, no result. It was so frustrating. It was just, felt like our history was this faded roadmap. It got bleached in the desert sun and there's just nothing. And then one day, I don't know what I did, maybe I changed the way that I spelled Haidan Asham, and suddenly this picture showed up. And I was blown away. First of all, I didn't picture it like that. I had this, romantic image of Yemen being all like sandy dunes and, palm trees. Apparently, it was quite cold at night, which does not explain my intolerance to cold at all. And it's very mountainous, And the other interesting thing that stunned me, of course, Tzion Ozeri is related to me by marriage, which proves my point that all Yemenis are related, unless proven otherwise. Tzion Ozeri, who gave me permission to use these photos, this, by the way, is built of mud in that style of building that I was talking about. Tzion Ozeri is the only Yemeni Jew I know who has managed to go back. These pictures were taken in 91. He went back with his American passport. I guess it was a time where Yemen was kind of more stable and it was just fine to go. And he's an amazing photographer who photographs Jewish communities all over the world, especially in like forsaken places. You can find more of his work on his website. He's a lovely man and does a really important work. So these are just some of his photos. Again, you see the mud bricks. The kettle always lived in the bottom of the house in Yemen. So around the mountains around Haidan Asham had all these caves in them. So like blacksmiths and silversmiths would set their shops there. And the Mori was teaching the kids the Torah in one of those caves. So that's what those boys are doing. And there's also a little girl hanging out there on the side, not studying the Torah. In 91? Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's some that came in the 90s and some even later on. Now there's like barely any. I think it's like under 100 for sure. But in the 90s, yeah, there was one immigration I think came in 93. And then, tipin, a few more later on.
If you notice on the picture, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
The kids in that age were able to read in all directions.
Yeah, that's right.
They were able to recognize the letter from right
because they had to share. That's right.
It depends. If they were lucky, they sat in front of. If not,
yeah.
They would just. When my father read the Talmud in a different way.
Yeah, that's right.
Are you sleeping or no? He was reading. It doesn't matter what
I know.
direction.
It's amazing, eh? Yeah, whatever direction you were from, that's the direction you learned. The well was the center of the Jewish woman, or the women in general, not just the Jewish women, the center of their lives. That's where everything happened. So I mentioned that I interviewed a bunch of women. This is one of them, and she's still wearing the sudia, which is the traditional headgear that they wore in Yemen. My grandmother eventually took it off and replaced it with a more modern, just a headscarf. This is the woman's, that's her husband, and he also has the simonim, they called it, as for simanim. That's the way that they recognize the Jews, the signs, the symbols. This is Rachel, who is a Henna singer. So it means she sings in Henna ceremonies, and we'll get to more pictures of Henna ceremonies in a minute here. Also Rachel, wearing an amulet, a Yemeni amulet like I do. This man, his name is Ayelet Tsabari, not related to me. He immigrated in the 90s. And he immediately invited us to his house to chew the gut. I did not chew the gut. The gut is this flowering shrub that is common in Yemen and other places in that area. And it's known to have this euphoric effect on the chewer and a stimulating effect. I tried it once. It was so bitter. You're supposed to chew it for hours. And it was so bitter that I gave up after a few minutes. I'm like, no, I don't really need to know. This was one of my favorite characters. Her name was Kadia, and she was my grandmother's cousin. And she came in the 60s. And as soon as we came, of course, she fed us. This is just chicken and turmeric, and this is grated tomato, which is a common condiment in Yemeni cuisine. And this is lachouch, which is similar to injera. It's made of teff or shurgum, and it's just... you can do it in a pan, I think, but they used to do it in an oven. Look how little she is. I mean, I'm tall, but still. And she's, I know. And you can see she's wearing the kabir, the traditional pants that I wore in my costume. And that's her daughter, Saida. So because they came in the 60s, they still maintain some of the traditions that my grandmother gave up fairly, early on. So she's grinding wheat here in an outdoor kitchen. She built an outdoor kitchen. And this is the oven. No, this is in Bnei Aish, which is a village near Rehovot.
It's every.
Yeah.
I remember my mom breaking it.
Sure, right? And that's just a few years ago. So I asked her, I wanted a recipe for lachouch. So she said, you put the teff on a sheet in the sun for a week, and then you rake it. I'm like, yeah, thank you. I have it written down. Here she's showing some of her jewelry. These are like Saudi coins, by the way, on her neck. So the Yemeni men in Yemen were craftsmen and artisans. This was their role in society. If you know, and many of them were silversmiths. So if my grandfather was a silversmith, if you ask, if you know a Yemeni Jew, ask them if they had a silversmith in their family, and they'll probably tell you they did. That's how common it was. It was so common, in fact, that when they left, they sort of took it with them. And that's an article from Yemen Times. Will the Jewish silver craft survive in Yemen? It just, it was such a rich, ancient tradition, and it was gone when the Jews left. And there's really no better way of admiring the artistry of the Jewish men, craftsmanship, as it is in the Henna ceremony, the bridal jewelry that is worn by the bride. This is my cousin, by the way. Her name is Noah. So what she's wearing on her head is called tishbuk lulu, and it's a crown of pearls. The Henna ceremony, I should mention, is done usually about a week before the wedding ceremony. In Yemen, they had two different ones, one for men, one for women. Nowadays in Israel, they do a symbolic party, and it's, the men and the women are doing it together. And it was just a way to symbolize the, passing on to your husband, going on into your husband's house, leaving your parents' home, and so on. So the tishbuk lulu that she's wearing is 22 pounds heavy. And it's supposed to represent the burden of marriage.
Should be heavier.
I know. This is shadab, which I think is called ruta plant in English, I think. But it's just against the evil eye, to repel the demons who apparently do not like the smell of it. And women walk around with those baskets. They have flowers, sometimes eggs, sometimes candles, and the idea, again, for fertility. It's a big party, basically. There's dancing, there's singing. So the bride changes her outfits 3 times. This is the second outfit now, more modest. This is that's called the gulgush, which is the hood. And that's the third one. And you see that she's got the smear of henna on her hands. Back in the day, they would have these really elaborate designs, but they don't really do that so much anymore in Israel. They just, it's supposed to be like a coin to represent, money and yeah, but I wish they did the elaborate, beautiful ones again. So people tell me my book made them hungry, which I totally take as a compliment. I think that food is really essential when writing about a culture. It's kind of it's another form of language almost. And it's the sensory details are such a great way to evoke. So I use it a lot in my writing, and also I just love food. So it's I'm drawn to it. But when I started being interested in my culture, one of the things that I wanted to know is how to make the traditional food that I grew up eating. So this is me and my mom making jichnun. This is when I learned it. I've always thought it was too hard, and it turns out it's too hard. So I've never made it again. This is the only time I made it. What it is, it's this Shabbat bread that is rolled and then layered in this special pot with a tight lid, and it's placed there for the whole night, in the oven for the whole night, which is why it's a Shabbat bread. We just moved from Israel to Toronto. This is in my kitchen in Toronto. My mom made that. So yeah, that's how it looks when it comes out. There's eggs baked in it for at least half the night. And again, you see the tomato paste. And this is the bisbas, or schug, which I'll talk about in a minute. And this is my mom showing off her creation. And this is just that's a mannequin, and Jewish Yemeni, the Yemeni the Museum of Yemeni Jewelry in Rosh Ain, a little girl making schug. So what is schug? Or we call it bisbas in my family. And it's here. It's cilantro, chili peppers, garlic. It turns to be on the spicy side, but it doesn't have to be. It's used like chutney or like salsa in a way that you can put it on the side of something. You can slap it on anything. I'd eat it on toast. I think it's delicious. My mom makes a ton of it at a time and freezes it. And she wears gloves, which is smart because it's spicy. And that's her recipe. She really struggled to make it into one little jar. She wanted to say like 5 bunches of cilantro. I'm like, no, let's tone it down. It is a bit loose. You have to play with it, allow for some trial and error. But it's really, really yummy. And I hope you try it, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Sorry?
Is honey uncommon? Honey uncommon?
In this?
No, for the rest of it.
No, we don't use that so much. No?
I thought you liked honey.
In Yemeni? No, we don't really eat honey in. No.
Thank you, Ayelet.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'll walk around with the mic for questions.
What was your path to Canada, and why Vancouver? You're mentioning Toronto and Vancouver. My father's from Montreal, but I mean the Jewish people are mostly in Montreal, Toronto. So how'd you get to Vancouver?
There was a guy.
You said your parents came in 1930 to Israel?
My grandparents.
Your grandparents?
Yeah, 1935.
But there weren't, my understanding is there weren't a lot of Yemenite Jews that came over then. It was mostly...
That's a misconception because we're not being taught Yemeni history or Mizrahi history. Then I get that a lot. In fact, the biggest Yemeni immigration came in 1881. It was called Ayelet Tsabari, and they settled mostly in Yafo and Rehovot and Yerushalayim. And then my great-grandmother, it's a complicated story, I can't get into it right now, but my great-grandmother actually came in 1907. And then my grandmother came in 1935, both sets of grandparents. So in fact, there were Yemeni Jews. They started trickling. There were even some evidence of some coming in the 1600s. But the big Yemeni immigration is Ayelet Tsabari, the first one. So it coincided with the Biluim, I guess. It's been erased, unfortunately.
I collect Yemenite jewelry, antique jewelry, yes. Their jewelry is the most fabulous in the world, and the story I got from the Israeli museum is that before the Yemenite Jews were allowed to leave Yemen, that the imam said that the Jews had to teach the Arabs how to work in jewelry, and it's never been the same since the Jews left.
Right, interesting.
Oh, and I have one more thing. I was there in 67 and 68.
In Yemen?
No, in Israel. And I had a Yemenite friend who eventually had to change his name because he couldn't go any further up the ladder in his education, and he had to change his name. And I thought, how sad that he wasn't respected for who he was and what he knew, that his name meant more than... So I give your people a lot of respect.
I think this gentleman here too.
Along with everything else, you gave up your community when you left Israel. What happened to the rest of your family?
So I have one brother who lives in Montreal, actually, but most of them they're still in Israel. I go to Israel for 2-3 months every year. So that's the best I can do right now. Yeah. It's, the immigrant story. It's heartbreaking. What can I say? But I try.
Ayelet, at the beginning of the talk, you spoke about writing in a language which wasn't totally your own. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the translation process into Hebrew, because I know your work's been translated into Hebrew, and how you've related to that, what part you played in that translation process.
So when I first imagined that the book would be translated, I really wanted it to be translated, obviously. I imagined it being read by, by my people. I wanted the approval of home. I imagined that I would be translating it, and I felt I have a sense of guilt sometimes. It's completely irrational, but I have a sense of guilt sometimes about writing in English, sort of betraying my mother tongue and falling in love with another. So I thought, that would be a way to sort of reconcile that. I'll translate the book, and I imagine myself like renting an apartment by the beach, because I wanted to be there when I do it. You want to be immersed in the language. And then I had a kid. And I was like, I don't have time to do this. This is, I can't, write an entire book again, basically, because it's not translation when it's your own work. You're rewriting the book from scratch, and I just couldn't imagine that. So by the time that the offer for Hebrew rights came, I knew I couldn't, but I really wanted to be involved. So what I did is I would get a story from the translator. The translation was good, which is important to mention. Nevertheless, I, messed it all up. Just changed things. During that time, half of the time I was in Canada and half of the time I was in Israel. And I made sure that I only read Hebrew during that time, because it was my way of immersing myself in the language. I'd keep a list of words that I love. If I read a word that I love, I'd put it down. I'm like, this word has to go in. So I just change words sometimes because I like them better. Sometimes, the sentences, change them up, deleted things, and I've added a couple things too. The story that I read, the first one, the Poets in the Kitchen Window, I actually originally wrote it in Hebrew. It was the last thing that I wrote in Hebrew, last story I wrote in Hebrew many years ago, and I found the story, and I looked it up, and I found some sentences that, even though I didn't translate it into English, I just wrote it completely again from scratch, I found sentences that stayed, that I sort of then in my mind translated into English, and then had the translator translate back into Hebrew. So I pulled those out and put the original in. And while I was at it, I just added a few more. So that story, I think, is the most altered. So it feels to me like when people ask me, people who speak both languages or read both languages ask me which book to read, I always tell them I don't think it really matters. I'm really happy with the Hebrew one. They feel like siblings books. I'm not attached to read the original, read the English one. The Hebrew feels it feels original. So, yeah.
Hi. I have two questions. One is, what's the source of your Brit Milah story, if you can talk about that story? And the second one is, what are your plans for the future?
Brit Milah came from when I started thinking about becoming a mother, maybe having a boy. I started having all these fears about it, and what am I going to do? And I started researching and looking into it, and it all, like with everything, if my fears, my preoccupations just funnel themselves into a story. So I just allowed myself to imagine. My mom is not as traditional as Uma, and I am not like Ofra at all. But I just try to imagine scenarios in which, a woman who's similar to me doesn't circumcise, and what happens in that scenario. It was just a safe way to explore that idea. That's basically it. So, and I was I said before how, I was scared when I decided to write about Israel. This is another example. I was scared writing that story. It felt like volatile or something, and then it turned out people really relate to it. People really love it, so it was interesting that the response was not at all what I feared it would be. And as for plans for the future, I am working on a book of essays, a memoir and essays, I call it right now, which is in final stages. I'm hoping next year.
Do you see yourself writing a book, not short stories or essays?
Yeah, and the book after that is going to be a novel. Yeah, I'm start in the early stages of that too. They're overlapping, the end of that one and the beginning of the novel. Yeah.
I don't need the microphone. Tell us about your amulet.
Oh, so there's not much to tell. It's just the women would usually put like something from Tehillim in it, or do you know more? Do you know about it? What they put inside? I think they just have like.
Wear it and it's sometimes it's like to protect them.
Yeah, so usually they have like, I put my own thing.
Mine came with a prayer in it.
Exactly, that's what I meant. Yeah, I said Tehillim, but like a prayer in it. I put my own little thing in it, but it opens. It actually opens. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that also, in the book I got from the Israeli Museum, that even if it didn't have prayer in it, but a lot of the women wore to ward off the evil spirit.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm wondering, first of all, thank you for that excellent talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the writing process. Are these short stories based on experiences you had, or is it just your imagination? Where do they come from?
I always say that my themes are very autobiographical, but the stories aren't, especially because I am writing an autobiographical, book, and I'm, so I've left that for that book. Often I would have scenarios that are taken from real life as well. Like me and my best friend used to travel to Eilat when we were 17 or 18 and go diving. That was a good basis to, go wild with that story. But the scenario, that little kernel of truth, that's all there was to it. I'm not that character, and my friend is not, at all that friend. I went to India, and I was often confused for an Indian, so that was a basis to imagine what would happen if I took it really far, and decided to live there and just abandon, where I come from and be Indian. So yeah, there is that, but mostly it's the truest thing about it, the most autobiographical thing is the preoccupations, and the themes, the things that haunt me. Like displacement, like immigration, like Mizrahi history and Yemeni history. So, yeah.
Really looking forward to reading your book. I'm curious if you have favorite American or Canadian writers.
Oh, I have many. Short story in particular?
Either.
I really love Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi. She wrote Americana. That's her most recent novel. I think she's amazing, fabulous writer. June Palahiri was another American writer that I love. I'd say I have more American favorites than Canadians, to be honest. A lot of them immigrants, yeah. There's transnational literature is something that, naturally I gravitate toward. I like Junot Diaz as well, again. Back on that theme. I feel like I'm missing someone really important, but I can't come up with it right now.
Okay, let's take one more. Oh, we'll do two more. Okay. I'll get you.
I don't think I need the microphone. This is not a question, but a comment. It really comes through what you're trying to do with the stories and with the Mizrahi focus. And we read, I have a class that we read your book here at the college in Hebrew. We did the Hebrew version. Yeah, so it was really cool. But what struck me most, I did sense all these things that you're emphasizing. Can't you hear me now? Oh, this has an echo. Anyway, while it was very focused on the Mizrahi aspect and experiences, yet obviously I'm not from a Mizrahi background, and it rang so true to me because of how you captured the immigrant experience. My parents came to Israel, didn't speak a word Hebrew, so I could relate, and I also liked how you do the interaction between mother-daughter. So if it's Brit Milah or something else, so I think it could appeal to a much broader group of readers because of the universal things that you touch upon. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a really nice comment. Thank you so much.
I also told that story, by the way.
Did you? Thank you.
You gave us a wonderful presentation. I have a question based upon something that someone asked you a moment ago. Are you familiar with the Canadian Jewish author Mordechai Richler?
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Older guy.
Yeah.
But he wrote a lot of stuff about the Jewish immigrant community in Montreal.
Montreal, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I just see a parallel with your experience. It's kind of having Canada splashed in his face.
Yeah.
Was his experience.
Yeah.
And yours too.
Oh, yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayelet.